Can everyone hear me? Okay, so, and I have the honor and pleasure of introducing my fellow panelists today. And so I'll start down on the end. Is Hillary French. Hillary is a program officer in the United Nations Environmental Program, or UNEP, in their North America Region Office. And Hillary joined UNEP from the World Watch Institute, and her work at UNEP currently focuses on climate change, resource efficiency, and the post-2015 development agenda. And she's previously advised UNEP on a wide range of issues, including consumption and production, green jobs, globalization, and the environment. And we are very fortunate to have Hillary here today to provide us with perspectives from the United Nations on integrated reporting. Right to my left here is Elizabeth Seeger. Elizabeth is a principal in public policy and affairs at KKR. Elizabeth joined KKR in 2009 to oversee management of environment and social responsibility issues and opportunities across KKR's portfolio, including through KKR's Green Portfolio Program. Previous to joining KKR, Elizabeth was at Environmental Defense Fund, where she served as a manager of their corporate partnerships program. And before that, Elizabeth was at the corporate executive board. We're very fortunate to have Elizabeth here today to provide us with perspectives on the important question of how investors are thinking about and pushing for integrated reporting. And then finally, a man that probably needs no introduction to many of you is Paul Hagen. He's a partner at Beveridge and Diamond, and Paul advises a diverse group of clients on multinational corporations and trade associations on market access, global supply chain, and product stewardship matters in the United States and in key markets worldwide. And Paul's expertise extends to conflict minerals, chemicals, and materials ban legislation and product take-back and the Basel Convention on transboundary movement of waste. Paul is here today to provide us, drawing from his experience in conflict minerals and other areas, with his insights on the benefits and challenges of integrated reporting. So let me just talk a little bit. I think the goal of this panel is to have an interactive discussion among this group and then open it up for questions and comments from the audience. But because we have a diversity of attendees today, what we thought we'd do is start with a primer, if you will, on what is integrated reporting. And apologies in advance to those of you who are old hands at this, but I think we thought we'd start with this so we could ground everybody in the issues. And so I'm going to first cover the concept of integrated reporting, and then we'll provide you with some basic information about the new International Integrated Reporting Framework, the IIRF, that you heard about a little bit from the other panel. And then I'll conclude with some key questions and turn it over to our panelists who will offer their insights on these questions. So, and here are the topics I'm going to cover here. So, first of all, you might be asking yourself, what is integrated reporting, and why would a company want to prepare such a report, or an investor or stakeholder? I'm going to take this out. It's easier for me. Would want to read such a report. And I think to talk about the impetus for integrated reporting, we should go back to the start here, which is what we've characterized as the traditional approach to sustainability reporting, which is also often referred to as ESG, or environmental, social, and governance reporting. And essentially the traditional approach has been to bifurcate, have separate ESG report from financial and other types of reports. And there have been criticisms of this traditional approach. And one of the main criticisms is that the bifurcated approach basically stifles thinking about the connections between financials and ESG. And as a result of not thinking about those connections, separate sustainability reports often fail to consider material issues, particularly medium and long-term issues. And that failure to consider material issues, in turn, is said to make the ESG reports less valuable for investors who care about ESG issues, because such investors would want to know how ESG issues pertain to a company's value and what ESG issues are material with respect to that company's value. So the solution to these criticisms with the traditional approach has been integrated reporting. And the notion here is that an integrated report would basically recognize both the direct financial capital of a company as well as non-financial items that should be regarded as capital due to the value these items bring to the bottom line of a company. So the concept here is that an integrated report is supposed to focus on how an organization creates value over time. And the concept here is that value is not created by or within an organization by itself, but is basically, first of all, influenced by the external environment. Secondly, is created through relationships that the organization has with stakeholders. And thirdly, is dependent on various resources. And the resources and relationships which create this value are basically what I've listed here on the slide: the financial, the goods, the IP, etc. And all of these resources and relationships are considered to be the capital of the organization. And so to prepare an integrated report, the notion is that an organization would form a multidisciplinary team and develop a process for assessing each of these forms of capital as it pertains to the value created by the organization over time. And that value manifests itself in increases or decreases or transformations of the capitals caused by the organization's business activities and outputs. And just, this sounds a little abstract, but I think you'll see where it's going. So basically, the value that the organization creates has two interrelated aspects. It's the value that's created for the organization itself, which enables financial returns to the providers of the capital, and the value created for others, so stakeholders and even society at large. And an integrated report is supposed to address both aspects, both of these aspects of value. So I want to turn now to the IIRC, which you heard about from our last panel. And just some basics. This was an organization established in 2010 to promote, standardize, and work with a wide range of stakeholders to implement integrated reporting. And this slide lists the IIRC's goals. And I'd like to just take a minute to emphasize aspects of these goals that I think will be important to hear about from my fellow panelists and from all of you when we open this up for the Q&A. So one of the issues in sustainability reporting generally has been, I think, a struggle to find information of sufficient quality and reliability. And that struggle would seem potentially to be more acute when it comes to integrated reporting, because in an integrated report, the ESG information has to be linked to and used to assess the company's current and projected financial health. And so it makes a lot of sense that the IIRC is focused on information quality as a key goal, because it will be a challenge in integrated reporting to do this. Integrated reporting, I think by its nature, seeks to achieve greater efficiencies, and that's one of the other goals, by allowing investors and other stakeholders to receive one report that presents a holistic picture, as opposed to requiring that they read and connect separate reports. So efficiency is another key goal. And then another goal to emphasize here is at least the IRC's notion that integrated reporting will enhance accountability of a company with respect to all forms of its capital. And I think that would seem logical to me, that once a company produces integrated reports that address all these different forms of capital I listed, financial and non-financial, that would over time allow a company to, if you will, be benchmarked and would be accountable for what it's saying. So these are the goals for integrated reporting, but you still might be asking yourself, what is integrated reporting? Because I think that the concept, when we talk about it generally, still seems very theoretical, and it's hard to boil it down to something more granular or practical. And here are a couple of definitions of integrated reporting. I think the first one from the IRC is referring again to this concept that they emphasize of value creation. The second definition may be a little more of a practical way to think about it, that integrated reporting is about moving to a more aligned understanding of the interplay between financial and non-financial factors. But that's still pretty abstract. So I think to make it a little more granular now, let's talk about the IIRC's pilot project and then the framework that they've developed. So the IIRC sponsored a 3-year integrated reporting pilot project that just ended in September of this year, and a number of companies participated in the pilot. I've listed some of the larger and more well-known ones here. And as an outgrowth of this pilot, the IIRC issued the International Integrated Reporting Framework, the IIRF. And time doesn't really allow us to review the IIRF in detail, but to just give you a sense of the structure of it, I'd like to just focus briefly on its guiding principles and then the content elements of an integrated report under the IIRF. So the first guiding principle is strategic focus and future orientation. And essentially the idea here is that this principle requires that an organization should provide insight into its strategy and how it relates to the organization's ability to create value in the short, medium, and long term, and to its use of and effects on all those different forms of capital that I mentioned. And applying this guiding principle under the IIRF is not limited, as you might think, to elements in the report about strategy or resource allocation. Rather, this principle of strategic focus and future orientation is supposed to guide the selection and presentation of other content as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, for example, this principle is supposed to guide the highlighting of significant risks and opportunities and dependencies that flow from the organization's market position and its business model. As another example, the views of those charged with governance, you're supposed to capture that and the factors that can change the relationship as to how the organization balances short, medium, and long-term interests and how it's learned from its past experience. The second guiding principle is connectivity of information. And the thought behind this guiding principle is that the more integrated thinking is embedded into an organization's activities, the more naturally the connectivity of information will flow into management reporting, analysis, and decision making, and subsequently into the integrated report. And the IIRF does provide some examples of what's meant by connectivity of information. So as one example, an analysis of existing resource allocation and how the organization will combine resources to make further investment to achieve its targeted performance. That's the concept of connecting all these different areas. As another example, linking the organization's strategy and business model with changes in its external environment, such as increases or decreases in the pace of technological change, evolving societal expectations, and resource shortages, from factors such as climate change. So that's another example about trying to connect all these disparate pieces together. A third guiding principle is that an integrated report should provide insight into the organization's relationships with key stakeholders. And here this relationship, the report should address how and to what extent the organization understands, takes into account, and responds to the legitimate interests and needs of key stakeholders. A fourth guiding principle is, and I think in many ways, and you heard this from the last panel, it's the most critical of the guiding principles, and it pertains to materiality. And the IRF is clear that an integrated report should disclose information that matters substantively and will affect the organization's ability to create value over not only the short term, but the medium and the long term. And the IIRF has a number of specific instructions as to what process an organization should use to make materiality determinations. And I think notably, to be most effective, the materiality determination process under the IIRF must be integrated into the organization's management processes and must include regular engagement with providers of financial capital and others to ensure that the integrated report meets the primary purpose of really getting at material issues in the short, medium, and long term. And one key element of materiality, and if you look in the IRF framework, there's actually a really fancy graphic that shows this. But one key element of it is that integrated reporting is supposed to identify what they call a reporting boundary for the integrated report that extends beyond the boundary that what you would use for financial reporting. And I think we'll be hearing from the other panelists about some of the challenges of establishing materiality that extends beyond that normal financial threshold, because the idea is it's supposed to be a boundary that goes beyond that. And I think the fifth and sixth guiding principles are important, but they're also arguably self-evident. An integrated report should be concise, reliable, and complete, and should be consistent over time to allow comparisons. So the next two slides review what content the IIRF believes should be contained in an integrated report. And I think in the interest of time, I won't dwell on these elements, but I would note that the most challenging of these content elements for companies likely would be, first of all, shown on this slide, the risks and opportunities, and then shown on the next slide, the outlook. And I say this because I think both of these items require a predictive assessment with reference to value. And as we talked about at the beginning, value is really here defined in these integrated reports as both financial and non-financial. And so I think that, as I think was well said by someone on the last panel, that, there's an element of a brave new world here. And so this can seem very theoretical and very conceptual, but that's how everything has to start, right? So I just wanted to flash this up here. There are other relevant standards. We're going to be hearing about those from my fellow panelists. So I don't want to go into these right now. And without much further ado, I want to turn it over to the panel. But before I do, I just want to frame a couple of questions that I think, the panelists will be addressing, and then we'll come back to as well. So one of the key questions is, who's the primary audience for this integrated report? Is it investors only? There are some who believe that, but there are others that believe that integrated report really should have a broader audience and be geared, to all stakeholders and the public at large. Another key question is, we framed it here, is integrated reporting more than the sum of its parts? I mean, there's sort of the idea you've got financial reporting and you have sustainability reporting, and you put them together. Well, do you really need to put them together? If you just put them together, people could read it separately if the information's out there. So the concept of this is it really needs to be more than the sum of its parts, and it needs to be connecting all these issues and describing the value that is brought to the organization in a material way from these non-financial factors. And so it's supposed to be more than the sum of its parts. I think a question is, will integrated reporting replace other reports? This is new. There's probably a lot of different views on that, but it's also a little bit of crystal balling here since it is so new. But a related question is, will integrated reporting be embraced by industry? The IIRC pilot program, they actually produced a report on it where they surveyed all the participants, and it's an interesting report to read, and we've included a link to it here. And I'm showing you some of the data, but the bottom line of it is that the participants actually, were very positive in the benefits that they saw to their organization from integrated reporting. So those who participated and really invested in it, by and large thought it was very worthwhile. But so far, integrated reporting is very limited in its adoption. If you look at the larger companies out there. So there is that question of whether it will be embraced. And there's I think another question, which is what are the most challenging aspects of integrated reporting? I've mentioned materiality, but I think there are some others as well. And so we're going to hear about all these key questions from our panelists. And with that, I will turn it over first to Elizabeth.
I'm going to follow your lead. How did you do that? I don't actually follow. All right. Follow your lead. And first of all, Julie missed the most important part of my resume, which is that 15 years ago, I got my start as a research associate at the Environmental Law Institute. So, yeah. So this is what happens. Yeah. So I get invited to be on panels 15 years later. So it's just a matter of time. Anyways, no, that's okay. It may not even be there, but I'm glad to be back. Thank you. As was mentioned, I work with KKR, and KKR is primarily known or historically known for its private equity business, which it really started about 40 years ago. I work primarily with our private equity companies, which means that I work with the companies that we invest in, take private, hold in our portfolio for 5 to 7 years, and then hopefully sell them back to the market for a better price than we bought them in the first place. And during those 5 to 7 years, we get a really solid amount of time to work with them on environmental social governance issues. And KKR has been now doing this systematically and publicly for well, at least since I've been at KKR in 2009, we've been doing a lot of reporting ourselves and working across the 14 different industries in which we're invested in our private equity portfolio on material ESG issues. And I wanted to give that context because we are not, I don't represent all investors. A lot of investors interested in integrated reporting or in ESG indicators are public investors or investors investing in publicly traded companies, trading stock, that sort of thing. That's not my primary focus, but it is certainly something that I've been involved in through SASB, which I'll talk about in a second. You guys don't read ahead. Don't read that. I'll get to that in a second. I wanted to give some context first on what's going on in the investor community, because I think what started as a low buzz is now maybe a low roar in terms of the amount of interest coming from the investor community, at least some really active investors out there, and I think that the number of active investors is growing, and I have some indicators of that. We certainly have a number of investor-led initiatives, such as the CDP. Now we have the Water Disclosure Project. We have is it the Forestry Disclosure Project? I'm looking at Chris because he's with CDP. Okay. We have the Montreal Pledge that Chris and I were just talking about, that is a number of investors who have just made a pledge in terms of carbon in their investment portfolios, which is brand new. It's coming out. I just heard about it myself, so we'll learn more about that. And then there's obviously the ratings agencies, which Wayne from IBM was talking about, reaching out to companies on behalf of investors, and we investors then purchase the ratings information that comes from the ratings agencies in order to make decisions in terms of which stocks to buy, which stocks to divest, that sort of thing. Or and not only buy and divest, but also engage with the companies and say, hey, you guys got a D, can you explain why, and how are you going to fix that, which we've actually done as well, and a number of other investors are doing. The second point sort of indicator is the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, of which KKR is a signatory. It's a sister organization to the UN Global Compact. There are now 1,295 signatories as of the information I got. 94% of the investors signed on to the PRI have a responsible investment policy. That means that they have committed to consider environmental, social, governance issues in some way or another when making investment decisions. So they are asking companies for information, buying information from ratings agencies, et cetera. Third point is Bloomberg. If you all don't know, they now include ESG information in the Bloomberg terminals. And so anybody who has a Bloomberg terminal can go in and see that information alongside the financial information. Statistic there is that year-to-date 2014, they had 12,000 so-called ESG users on the terminals accessing the ESG data, compared to just over almost 5,000 in 2010. So a significant increase in the last 4 years. And final sort of proof point is there are a lot of sort of one-off investor initiatives. So I mentioned some of the organizations, CDP, Water Disclosure Project, but there are also a number of investors that are coming together, signing letters, filing resolutions together. Most recent one that I saw was a number of investors writing a letter to the EPA to support methane regulation. So we're coming together and actually presenting a combined front to companies as well as regulators on a lot of these issues. And the key point that many of us investors think is that ESG issues are not non-financial issues. They are financial issues, or they can be financial issues, and they should be treated as financial issues when they are material to the companies. And so that is what is sort of the foundation of a lot of these investor-led initiatives, and something that's really important to keep in mind as we think about integrated reporting and what I'm going to talk about next, which is SASB, is these issues are financially material, and how we define, or how do we prove that, and how do we decide which ones are material and which ones are not, is what a lot of these frameworks and standards are about. So I'm going to talk about SASB next. I am not, obviously, I don't work for SASB. I'm a volunteer on their Standards Council, and that's the body that actually pressure tests all the standards and metrics that come out of the working groups that SASB creates, and make sure that they are coming out in accordance with SASB's protocol for defining what is a material issue and what are the metrics for that. So we've been doing that for a couple of years now, and I'll talk about the timeline in a second, but I did want to just say that don't quote me on behalf of SASB. You can quote me on behalf of myself. SASB is actually focused on materiality as defined by the Supreme Court for information included in the Form 10-K in the MD&A section. Does anybody here actually read the 10-K forms as part of their day job? Oh, good. Anybody enjoy it? I try to read KKRs every once in a while. Hasn't worked yet. So SASB is very much focused on that reporting framework. It already exists. There's already a definition of materiality. SASB is not seeking to redefine the reasonable investor, is not seeking to redefine materiality, is not seeking to create a new section of the Form 10-K. It is seeking to create the standards and metrics that allow companies to assess what might be material for them and include that information in an existing reporting framework that goes to investors. So it's fairly narrow, but it's narrow in the sense that it's not trying to change the world, but it is trying to create those standards and metrics such that all companies in a number of different industries can use them for reporting in that framework. So here's some facts about SASB. I'm not going to read it to you. A lot of what I said is already up there. And I actually forgot I can change the things myself. The SASB is very good at being transparent about its own process. So if you're interested in how it works, please go to their website. It's sasb.org. It's pretty easy. It's modeled after FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board. And so it's a 501c3. They have the same sort of expectations in terms of creating standards. They are not part of the SEC, but they communicate with the SEC regularly, update them on how things are going. And they're really, again, as I mentioned, trying to create these standards that are useful both to investors and to companies. So creating something that companies can use in their 10K to consider, are these things material or not? If so, these are the metrics that we should use. And then for investors, creating that set of comparable data, which we all know doesn't really exist right now, in a way that is decision useful. So a lot of the conversations that we have in the Standards Council are, is this in fact material? Do we think that this passed the materiality threshold that SASB has defined in accordance with the Supreme Court definition? Yes, no. Is this information decision useful? In other words, could an investor actually take this data and make a decision based on it? If not, then we need to go back and think about how do we actually collect data that allows investors to do that. And in the end, what am I pointing at? Okay. In the end, SASB is focused on creating standards for more than 80 different industries in 10 different sectors, and this is the timeline that SASB is following right now. So, it's a multi-year project. I don't know if we're halfway through it. I think we might be halfway through it now, where again, if you're interested in the process, definitely go look at the SASB website. They're always looking for participants in these industry working groups, and you all are all welcome to do that. Just two things to keep in mind, and then I'll pass it on. One, to Eric's point when he was talking about the GRI, different stakeholders have different interests, and so SASB and I represent the investor interests. Obviously, you guys all know that, but I just want to underline that as well, because that's one of the things that people might complain about in terms of SASB. It's very narrowly focused. It doesn't take the place of other reporting frameworks. And second is like I said before, different investors care about different things. So the SASB standards will come up with a minimum set of standards that could be financially material to a company, but some investors might have their own issues that are important to them that go beyond the minimum set of standards. Political contributions, for example, diversity across their portfolio, that sort of thing. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. So I think next we'll hear from Hillary, who's going to give us perspectives from the UNEP world.
Great. Well, thank you very much, first of all, to both of you for those very informative presentations. I learned a lot from them myself, because I have to confess here that I'm not really an expert in this whole world, in the intricacies of it. So I think the remarks I'm about to make here are going to take us to a slightly broader level, if you will, rather than the details of some of these frameworks that are out there. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot of some of the momentum that we see coming from the international community for more transparency from companies, and clearly moving in the direction of integrated reporting. Whether or not those of you who are experts will consider it integrated, I mean, I think there's a long way to go before we get to quite the level of detail that's being talked about here today. But I did want to at least give folks a snapshot of some of the things that have been going on in the sort of the global diplomatic world, really, and of course that reflects the will of governments around the world. So it was interesting a couple of years ago at the Rio Plus 20 conference in Rio, the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, to see issues of corporate sustainability reporting receiving quite a bit of attention in the official, what's called the outcome document from the summit. Now, of course, lots of other issues received a lot of attention at Rio as well because it was a very broad agenda there. But there was a whole movement that involved perhaps many of you, investors, for example, were very active. UNEP is a finance initiative that works with investors, and there was a lot of lobbying really going towards strong language on the issue of corporate sustainability reporting to come out of the Rio conference. What we ended up with was something called Paragraph 47, which is a bit of an insider-ish thing. In fact, and I'm going to talk in a minute about the fact that I'll tell you a bit about what the language says, but then after it was agreed to, there was a group called the Group of the Friends of Paragraph 47 that was formed. So who knew that anyone could get quite so excited about a Paragraph 47? But anyway, what Paragraph 47 does in fact say is that we, and this is the governments who signed on to this, all, more or less all of the governments of the world, acknowledge the importance of corporate sustainability reporting and encourage companies, where appropriate, especially publicly listed and large companies, to consider integrating sustainability information into their reporting cycle. And it goes on a bit and does, again, the word integration pops up several times. The United Nations is called upon to help develop models for best practice and to facilitate action, again, for the integration of sustainability reporting, taking into account experiences from already existing frameworks and paying particular attention to the needs of developing countries, including for capacity building. So a few things to kind of pull out of this sort of bureaucratic language. This was a call for governments, the United Nations, and other stakeholders to further engage with advancing sustainability reporting, to build on existing frameworks, and also a recognition that sustainability reporting is relevant globally, and that the needs of developing countries, including capacity building, should be given particular attention. As I mentioned, this group called the Friends of Paragraph 47 emerged to basically, to be frank, these countries had hoped for stronger language coming out of Rio that was more in the direction of mandatory reporting, and they didn't get that. But the 4 countries that were really behind this are Brazil, Denmark, France, and South Africa. And they launched this group called the Friends of Paragraph 47. They were joined by several other countries, including Austria, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Switzerland, and Norway. So it's an intergovernmental group. And they asked UNEP to provide, and the Global Reporting Initiative, I should point out, of course, to work together to provide the secretariat for this initiative. So that is now happening. And one of the things this group has been working on is to actually, again, continue their push for stronger language on sustainability reporting and on integration more generally into the post-2015 development agenda that's now being negotiated at the UN. So this is what's going to replace the Millennium Development Goals. And this is, the hope is that this is going to be adopted by the UN General Assembly in September. These will be, there was a call, as many of you may know, coming out of Rio for Sustainable Development Goals. So we'll see how the Sustainable Development Goals get integrated with the more general development goals of that the Millennium Development Goals reflected. But anyway, there is already a draft of the Sustainable Development Goals on the table, and it includes, again, some language about reporting. The draft of the Sustainable Development Goals encourages companies, especially large and transnational companies, to adopt sustainable practices and to integrate, again, sustainability information into their reporting cycle. So again, the push seems to be coming for more integration and for governments to play a role in fostering it. And I guess I just wanted to point out that several of these countries that I mentioned already, Denmark, and in particular Denmark, France, Norway, and South Africa, in their own domestic legislation have been taking quite a few steps to promote integrated reporting. In Denmark, for example, there's something called the Financial Statements Act that requires sustainability information to be included in the management review section of a company's annual report. In France, sustainability information is to be included also in a company's management report. In Norway, there's an accounting act that was extended in 2013 requiring companies to disclose how sustainability information is integrated into their business strategies, operations, and stakeholder relations. And South Africa has recently taken steps to update its code on corporate governance requiring integrated reporting by listed companies in the sense that environmental and social governance and financial factors are supposed to be disclosed in a holistic manner. So I guess the point is there seems to be some definite momentum building around the world for movement in the direction of integrated reporting. Now, which exact framework that will rely upon, we've heard that there are a number of them out there, and UNEP and this initiative, the group, the Friends of Paragraph 47 and so forth, are not promoting or advocating any particular one. But I think there appears to be momentum in that direction, and UNEP looks forward to continuing to work with those who are interested in this to help move the ball forward. Thank you very much. Paul.
Thank you. So we'll turn it over to Paul.
Sure, I think hopefully that mic is on. If not, I'll speak up. I think there's a whole lot of promise in the whole discussion of the integrated reporting. I'm just glad it's Wayne Baltz's job to operationalize it, not mine, because it looks very complicated. But to go back to something Wayne said on sort of the origins of transparency and the power of transparency to move the needle. I do remember the TRI stuff, and I actually had that in my notes from yesterday to raise. The TRI reporting, we all know the story, forcing the transparency, forcing the pollution release down, even though it was just reporting. It wasn't sort of a mandatory command and control kind of thing. But I also remember having to go to Georgetown University for one of 2 computers in Washington that actually had the information. It was a very HAL-like computer, and you actually needed an assistant at the library to help run this very special machine. And there were 2 of them in Washington, where if I wanted to check on Wayne's facility, I could actually look it up, zip code, find it, and lawyers got paid to go find that at one point in time. And now, obviously, all this information is abundantly available, thanks to IBM making data available all the time. But it's just remarkable, sort of the swing of transparency that we've gotten from a regulatory standpoint into this space. I think if we had Elizabeth, speaking from the investor community and Hillary speaking from the diplomatic community, I think I'm probably the compliance community person on the panel. And I guess I'll just start with a couple of observations there, and Julie and I were talking about this earlier. It seems that we've had this path that we've talked about this morning of the targeted CSR type reporting, and now this movement to embrace the integrated reporting, and there seems to be a need for that. And I guess the part I see is that's going to be challenging as we go forward is the mandatory side of that CSR reporting. It's been pretty wide open. There have been standard setting processes. Companies have been coming forward with a lot of information over time. But as governments step into that space and say, here's how you will do a conflict minerals disclosure in the US for SEC purposes, and then Canada says, and here's how you will do that in Canada, and the EU says, here's how we want you to do it in the EU, those will be hard edges that the fuller disclosures have to play against. And then you have, as you said, France, Denmark, the stock exchanges also putting in mandatory requirements. And I think the observation I have is that as the standards feel like the incubators for innovation and we can adjust those, I don't know that we're going to revisit Dodd-Frank again anytime soon. We're kind of stuck with that one for a while. So it'll be interesting to see how the pull of the markets and the transparency that's developing around the standards sits beside some of those legal requirements. I think the other issue I have, which is maybe a perfect one for ELI to explore, is just the observation that it seems part of what is happening with the integrated reporting and the increased transparency is really standing in for more constrained resources of regulators and governments, and I think longer term it'll be interesting to see the metrics on what are the environmental improvements of our collective efforts, and how do we measure those and how do we value those. I'll just pick one example, and happy to spend some time talking about conflict minerals and those requirements, but if you look at just one instance of conflict minerals in terms of how the legal requirements work, they basically set up a mechanism where companies that use conflict minerals, tin, tantalum, tungsten, gold in their products, if you are using those, you have to go through an exercise of where those may have originated if you're a publicly traded company. If you think they've originated from the region, you have to go through an exercise of due diligence, finding out have you sourced those from folks who are connected to the conflict there. There is a way to move to a very coveted DRC conflict-free logo, which is to vacate the region, source from somewhere else. And so there is a legal driver and perhaps even a market incentive for retailers and others who might want to have that conflict-free gadget or product. And that has to be balanced against an NGO community that's a little bit more sophisticated in their approach, to say, no, we're not going to score you high for a DRC conflict-free product. We want you engaged in the region with all of the uncertainty, all of the challenges of working in an area that lacks the basic governance structures. And that might prevent you from getting the DRC label because of other legal constraints. But it's interesting how we have to balance what may not be in the first instant obvious, which is sort of getting to the end point of DRC conflict-free. That may be legally compliant and the market may want that, but you may have a very invested NGO human rights community say, no, we don't want you to go that route. We think you have to take a different approach, which might not be as clean and easily recognized. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to sort of circle back to some other observations, but I know you want to get a bit of a discussion going around some other challenges.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was very helpful, and thank you, Elizabeth and Hillary. So just sort of a time check here, Linda. We have about 20 minutes left? Okay. Okay. So, and then time for questions. Okay. So I guess maybe one thing I thought we should talk about a little bit here is I kind of listened to what the panelists have to say and thought a little bit about this integrated reporting area myself. One thing that occurs to me is we sort of, and Paul put it well, there's the compliance side of where you're trying, and I think this is a SASB effort, is focused on basically taking sustainability into the existing compliance structure for SEC reporting. And then there's potentially the concept of, the IARF being beyond that compliance structure. And I guess I'd be interested in hearing from the panelists, is that the right way to look at it? And, what are the, risks and benefits of having an integrated report that goes beyond that, existing compliance structure, if that makes sense?
It does make sense, but I think I'm the only non-lawyer in the room. So
You can talk about it from the investor perspective.
From the investor perspective, as I said, we think, or some of us think, more of us think that ESG issues are or can be financial issues, and therefore should be integrated in the communications that are going to investors. And there are many ways that a company will a company will communicate to its investors. There's the Form 10K, there's the roadshows, there's all the various decks that we create for our investors. There are a number of different ways that we are communicating with investors all the time, and integrated reporting to me isn't a document. It is making sure that that information is being considered and communicated to the investors so that they can make a decision based on that. Now, I will say, for many companies, they'll tell you that their investors aren't asking them these questions, and I would say there's probably there's more of that going on where the investors are asking companies those questions, but oftentimes these investment firms have somebody like me who aren't really front-facing with the companies, but are actually collecting that information, looking online, oftentimes involved in engagement with the companies. So even if the questions aren't coming from the investors on a day-to-day basis, there's often somebody there doing the analysis, buying information from the ratings agencies. So just because you aren't getting those calls from the people that you interact with on a regular basis, somebody is looking for that information. So again, it's really about integrating in the communications versus a particular format that we're looking for.
I'll just make an observation that we don't really know what the integrated reporting will look like in the marketplace going forward. I think Vicki did a nice job of outlining where some of the green guides and the FTC issues kind of brush up against this stuff. And my sense is that the FTC has been much more inclined to scrutinize product claims and challenge those, and perhaps gives a little more room for corporate posturing around sustainability and green issues. But as this reporting becomes more prominent and more significant, they might take a greater interest in what's being bundled up into those reports to see if it is deceptive in some way. I mean, folks way outside my lane, but just the securities laws in terms of what investors respond to. Again, I think there are other legal frameworks out there. We've seen folks try to use state consumer protection laws to challenge CSR reports, and so I think it'll be, it's another, in a way, the significance and success of the integrated reporting may increase its importance, and therefore you have to see how that sits against some other existing legal frameworks.
Hillary,
That's okay. Thanks.
one question I had for you actually is about you mentioned the UN, I think you mentioned the UN guidelines on sustainable investing guidelines. And I guess I'd be interested if you had some insights on those and how they might relate to this integrated reporting area.
Right. This is maybe the principles for responsible investment that I think Elizabeth actually mentioned. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right.
Right. And she may want to pick up on this, but again, UNEP was involved through our finance initiative in the development of those principles for responsible investment. So I think it's kind of taken on a life of its own to some extent, moved beyond UNEP at this point. But certainly some of those principles, it would seem, are highly relevant to this effort. So I would imagine that things like the IIRC initiative and things, we're looking at them as they develop the reporting frameworks. But Elizabeth, I don't know, did you want to comment? further on that?
I'll just add the PRI, UN Principles for Responsible Investment, have 6 principles, I think one of which is specifically about commitment to consider the ESG issues in the investment decision-making process. And investors have been signing on to it for a number of years now. What's new is that the PRI is now requiring all of its signatories to fill out a survey every year to explain exactly how they are living up to that principle. And so all of us investors not only have to answer that question, but then a portion of our answers are published publicly, a mandatory portion of those things. So there's sort of a growing incentive for investors to be very clear on how they are considering ESG issues in their investment decisions. So I expect that will also have an impact on how investors interact with companies.
Can I just make a comment on, I think that the UN organizations, other international organizations, I actually think that having those international bodies engaged on these issues and grounding the discussions is really critical to their long-term success for at least the folks I work with. In the conflict mineral space, there's a big effort to get everyone to key off of the OECD due diligence guidance. It's a multilateral effort. It'll inform what's required under the SEC rules. It's probably going to inform what's required in the EU. Hopefully Canada will queue off it. But think about how that works if you have large economies making it up as they go along. The U.S. is already under Dodd-Frank focusing on the DRC conflict region. In one spot, the EU is thinking of all conflict regions. So there's always going to be some variation among how governments support that. But having the UN or international standards bodies sort of ground the tools and thinking and the framework, whether it's in the TRI space, to go back to that example, we had NAFTA for a time working on PRTR issues. We have the OECD, as I said, with conflict minerals. We seem to have the EU and more integrated reporting taking the lead on laying out some of those frameworks. But to me, I think getting that right, rather than devolving to just national approaches, is going to be really important.
Well, so picking up off of that, I think one question that's, raised, at least in the IIRF context, and there's been discussion about whether the standard for integrated reporting that they issued, that framework, whether it should even use the word materiality. And I think that, there seemed to be a debate because some felt that if you use that word, it's a legal term, it's defined as, we heard from Vicki, by the Supreme Court decision, and, well, it's obviously, has some play in the joints. I mean, it's a well-defined legal concept, and I guess there were some involved in the IRC pilot that basically felt that they should use a different word. I think the idea being, if you use this legal materiality word, you're constraining the report, and you're sort of, making it really connected to the compliance. And, there were some that wanted to push it to be broader. And I guess I would welcome comments on that. I mean, I think the idea, they kept the word. They decided, no, it's a well-defined word and everyone's familiar with it. But by doing that, are they perhaps limiting, the breadth of what these integrated reports might cover? That's a hard question, but I think
it's a good question, and I think one of the things that we think about is that material also means different things from a disclosure perspective to us than it does from a management perspective, right? So that's what right.
I think
so
they kept it.
Right. So it's a good question. I don't have an answer, unfortunately, on how to approach that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have a good answer either, but it's something that's definitely been part of the debate here. But I guess I'm kind of fall on the side of them keeping the term because of what you said. I mean, there is that legal disclosure, requirement, but as a manager. And the idea of integrated reporting is to take sustainability and really integrate it into the management structure of a company. I mean, managers care about something beyond the just minimum disclosure of materiality, particularly if you think of it in a medium and long-term way too. So,
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I would love to hear that.
Josh Heltzer from First Environment. I would say the term materiality has been used in the ESG community also for quite some time, and I think, frankly, as aspects once thought external become internalized, so-called non-financial aspects, environmental meets the financial, and so what comes down to the end is what's material. Right, and I think part of the issue, concern, case is, well, if I put it in the four corners of the law, right? Because if I put it in the four corners of my 10K SC report, whoa, I got a problem. BP mentioned earlier. Well, BP Beyond Petroleum, right? They were the darling of the environmental community, right? Anyone can have. I don't know the facts. Anyone can have an accident, right? If you look at tear up from the old days of TIRA, you looked at facility reporting. Maybe multimedia reporting at facility. Now you tear up to GRI corporate reporting, right? And these are problematic because what type of you make. So I guess in the end, ultimately is the concern. I would say that environmental and financial communities, yeah, they want that same interest. But the concern is, my statement that I make, and is someone going to be able to get me? I think because someone will assume because I made a statement that wasn't exactly right. I might not even known about it.
Well, no, I think that's right. I mean, there are these liability issues that are looming here, and I mean there have been some prominent cases, the BP case being one of them, but there are others, and that there's clearly that risk, and that risk grows particularly when you're talking about either sort of the marketing, greenwashing side of this, or I think when you're talking about some of the more predictive elements that are supposed to be part of an integrated report, the medium and long term. Because I've talked to some companies that say we do sort of an integrated report, but what we don't do is that materiality piece of it as fully as the framework would expect you to do it. And there's different reasons why you might or might not, but at least one of them I would think would be concern about liability. Should we open it up for some questions? Don't be shy.
Richard Cashmanian with EPA's Policy Office. One concern which gets raised with respect to integrated reporting is what will it do to sustainability reporting? So if a company has a sustainability report which is like 60 or 80 or 100 pages long, will it continue to have that content there? If it were to integrate, it may just take the essence of that report. And I think that one audience that gets missed for these reports are other companies to learn from their peers. So we may be turning into integrated reporting, which is great for investors, but not so informative to other companies. Do you have a response to that concern?
Do you guys want to comment on that?
Well, I mentioned at the end of my remarks that different stakeholders have different interests in the information, and the integrated report and the SASB standards certainly don't tick the boxes for everybody. And I don't think that the SASB standards and probably the integrated report take the place of the other standards like GRI that are out there that represent other stakeholders that are interested in the information. You know, what was, you know, but I think that what the integrated reporting movement, the SASB movement, whatever you want to call it, helps us do is cut through some of the clutter that's out there. And perhaps, you know, a lot of companies are spending a lot of time and money generating information that nobody wants. So I think maybe it's helping people think about, you know, what's important and what's not. I'm not saying that that's the solution, but, you know, SASB sent me an interesting statistic, and this again doesn't answer your question, but according to their research, they showed that approximately 75% of currently reported ESG info is immaterial to the business that's reporting it. And that remaining 25% is rarely reported in a way that's comparable and decision useful. And so, you know, that 75% may be important and helpful to other stakeholders, or it may not. I think it's sort of, it requires some pressure testing.
I mean, my comment would be that, you know, we're at the front end of this and we're not sure where it's going to go, but at least the way this framework has been developed for integrated reporting on paper, I think that it is broader than, you know, what investors would care about or the disclosure compliance obligations. And so at least what it says is that these integrated reports, if they're done fully, you know, as the framework envisions, they would be beneficial for other companies to read, and you wouldn't lose, you know, what you say as a goal. Now, I recognize that, you know, perhaps if they're too focused on materiality and too focused on what investors want, you might lose that. But at least in theory, there's, you know, the way it's structured, they're supposed to go beyond the financial, and I think you're supposed to use them to benchmark against your peer companies.
So I just wanted to add a comment on this. I actually think there's some deep theoretical tensions within what is being introduced as integrated reporting. I think the emphasis on materiality is in significant conflict, as Richard has just suggested, with the idea that you want to report to different audiences in different formats. And I actually think there's huge value in GRI with its depth for a certain audience, and would hate to see that lost as people pare down to a certain core set of things for an integrated report. So having argued earlier today, and I stand by it, that there's a value in sharpening the focus on the value drivers that come out of sustainability for the investor community, I'm worried about this push for an integrated single report. I frankly think it's not right, because there are different aspects of sustainability that need to be talked to in different ways. And I think there's value in those multiplicity of reports. And frankly, the experience historically with trying to bring it all together has not been good. The Clinton administration had a sustainable development effort that included so many things, including, by the way, not just environment, social, governance, but included prison recidivist rates, you know, teenage pregnancy rates. Everything can be thought of as sustainability in one way or another. But when everything is in, nothing is a priority. And frankly, it's confusing to audiences to have to wade through that much stuff. So I am concerned about the move from the theoretical attraction of integration, which I think does have an element, to the practical application, which may break down the multiple uses, Richard having highlighted one of them. And Hillary, I thought, was very careful in saying not that we're going to have a single integrated report but that the concept of integration, of thinking about environment in the context of other things, may be what the real goal here is.
I mean, one reaction I would have to that, I guess, is, you know, again, it's just the framework envisions that a benefit of the integrated report is internal to the company, that you would actually, and when you look at their survey of the companies that participated in the pilot, the idea is that the integration process has these internal benefits because you have more cross, you know, functional communications about sustainability. And if you think about that not being, you know, too sort of restricted by a strict materiality, you know, requirement, then you could see the integrated report actually, you know, being broader and actually having these benefits of, you know, producing a report that I think is, I guess I think of it as broad, still broad enough that it should meet some of these needs, although I don't profess to understand all the, you know, communities and needs served by the GRI process. But at least in theory, it could if it wasn't tamped down by materiality. Well, I hear them saying they're worried that's going to be too restrictive, that there's information that would still be relevant to your competitors, and that people in the community, you know, some stakeholder communities, you know, NGO communities would care about, but it doesn't sort of strictly fall into the rubric of what is material as defined by the SEC, and maybe to a company strictly in terms of its bottom line. That's what I hear them saying. Right, it's pretty abstract.
Hi, Julie Dunn Dion with IBM. It's been a long time. I mean, the way I look at it is I think there is, people may be confusing two topics. I think many companies are motivated to do so-called integrated reporting. We're going to do that today. For the purpose of what you said about internal communication, getting people to know other parts of the company. But I think people use this word integrated reporting very loosely. One is strictly materiality, the SEC guideline. I think that's very important, discipline to stick to, and not to be mixed with wanting to have a comprehensive report, wanting to serve multiple stakeholders, quote unquote. I think if we try to be more disciplined in speaking about what we mean, I think that would be helpful. I personally believe materiality is an important aspect that guides company to produce meaningful and not like, you know, all over the place, sort of like a report that's so-called integrated report. Because you end up putting so many things, it's not a priority in such a report. But again, because people use this term so loosely, it's very confusing.
As you're passing it, the other term that's used loosely is report. And I mean, to the point of sharing information between companies, a report may not be the best way to do that either. Maybe it's, you know, over a dinner table or something like that. And so, you know, there are many different ways that we can communicate with our stakeholders that are better than, you know, what we think of when we say report too.
Value, right.
So that's a narrow
No, that's
helpful
helpful.
to me.
Oh, hi, I'm Sally Fisk with Advisor. I just wanted to thank you all. It's been a really interesting discussion. I have one comment on integrated reporting and then one sort of question on the materiality issue. With respect to integrated reporting, it would seem to me that kind of the end goal for any good corporate sustainability program is to have sustainability integrated into the business strategy so that your chief sustainability officer's job kind of goes away at some point because it's just what you do and how you do business, which would seem to make integrated reporting sort of a natural outcome of that result. But I think to kind of push it on companies before maybe they've gotten to the point of that seamless integration of sustainability would be premature and could actually sort of end up with a very sort of muddy looking report where you're kind of putting all these various bits and pieces together and trying to draw connections that maybe haven't fully developed yet because the program is still in its infancy or still in its journey. So I'd kind of like your thoughts on that. And then my second question, for companies that report it in the United States and use the SEC rules, I just wonder to what extent the rules currently would require a sustainability issue to be reported if it is indeed material to the company, as SEC did with climate change. It sort of took climate change as an issue and applied its currently existing rules and said, the existing rules apply. You need to be looking at this issue too. So what does SASB sort of add to that that requirement beyond what's already required by reporting material issues? Thank you.
Maybe you should take that second.
I'll take the second one anyway.
You take the first one. You need to jump.
Try to remember the first one because I'm going first. So SASB is not changing the meaning of materiality and disclosure of material issues. It does not seek to do that. What it is working to do is help define the minimum set of issues that could be material for each of the different industries that it's looking at, and then allowing or expecting the companies to then actually consider those issues and define for themselves which of those issues are material or not. So SASB is and a number of others of us are really trying to create the guidance for the companies that they feel doesn't really exist from the sort of the decision useful materiality perspective, materiality perspective in terms of disclosure that companies really need at this point. And then they are also, as part of those standards, creating metrics that will be provided to companies that are intended to be able to collect information that's comparable across the different industries. So it's going to be sort of a library of, like I said, minimum standards that companies can then consider for that form, 10K.
Sure. Well, Sally, I think the takeaway for your question was sort of, are the companies ready, and how much can they take on? And I guess that's, from a compliance standpoint, that's the challenge I see. I mean, we've been fortunate to have folks essentially go in-house with, Fortune 50, 100 companies and work with the team on just one thread of this whole conversation, conflict minerals, chasing the stuff in your products all the way back to the mine through a global multi-tiered supply chain that's never been looked at before. And there's another person in the company who's doing that for legality for timber, tracing the wood products back through legality systems all the way back to the stump. There's folks who do climate work, which I do not do. And your colleague, Mike Mahoney, Pfizer's been really committed to thinking about the climate issue. Somebody has to do that carbon disclosure. And so the concern I have is each of those requires some of the best people in these companies to figure it out, to bring those teams together and then bring forward some actionable information. And I don't know that a lot of companies are going to be ready to start bundling that into an integrated piece. And I'm not going to pretend that I understand all of what is being laid out in that framework. But for the pieces that I work on, I see each one as being really challenging and demanding. And so, maybe we will definitely have to walk before we run on some of that.
Well, it seems quite clear that we could spend an entire day on any of the topics that these panels are addressing, but this has been a really interesting conversation, and please join me in thanking the panel.